Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Quantera Global Transfer Pricing Method podcast, where we aim to update and inform you on different aspects of transfer pricing. I'm your host, Adriaan van der Heijden, Director at Quantera Global. Quantera Global is one of the largest independent advisory firms specialized in transfer pricing. We have a global network in more than 50 countries, and for the last 10 years, over 400 multinational companies trusted us with taking care of their transfer pricing projects of any complexity. We are formed in freedom and follow our own directions to deliver excellent results to our clients and partners. Our experts of today are Richard Slimmen and Luca Nieddu, and we will be discussing advanced pricing agreements, both from a Dutch and Italian perspective. Richard has over 25 years of experience in transfer pricing and is one of the founders of Quantera Global. Richard has also headed the APA team of the Dutch tax authorities in the past and has value experience in the field of APAs and discussions with tax authorities worldwide. We're also happy to introduce Gianluca, CEO and founder of Muse Strategy. Gianluca is an Italian CPA with a strong focus on international taxation, transfer pricing, and operational modeling. Having worked with multinational enterprise for more than 20 years, Gianluca has also gained relevant experience in risk management projects and international tax controversy, including APAs and MAPs. Richard, Gianluca, thank you both for your participation in this podcast today. We will be discussing the following topics: the most relevant features of APAs in both the Netherlands and in Italy, pros of obtaining an APA, and finally, things you should consider before embarking on an APA. Let's start with the Netherlands. Richard, can you give us some insight on the most relevant features of APAs in the Netherlands?
Okay, thank you, Adrian. Of course, I can and I will. And please bear in mind that I'm not going to go from A to B to C on the process of an APA. I just want to highlight some things that I think are relevant to be aware of. One of the first things that I like about the Dutch APA practice, for instance, is that it's an integrated approach from all relevant parties that have to deal with the APA in the end. That means that you have your local inspector, you have your APA team, you have your MAP team in case it's a bilateral, and they all work more or less on an integrated fashion towards a case file, which means that it can be very dynamic, but also very speedy, and the process takes usually less time than some other countries that have a consecutive involvement of people along the way. So an integrated approach, I think, is a very good way of making an efficient process. I think if you consider the Dutch history, we are traditionally a country that has focused quite a bit on rulings and APAs, and there have been some changes over time. Nowadays, I think there is a limitation in scope in respect of APAs. That means that you can no longer have an APA with a tax haven involved. That is obviously due to all the international developments. And the transparency has increased so that the APAs are being exchanged between countries. That is something to consider. Um, Another thing that I would like to highlight on the Dutch APA practice is that um, it's an approachable process. The people are welcoming advisors and companies to actually step forward and raise their case, and are willing to discuss first whether or not there is a possibility to get to an APA. And if that is decided upon, they will think along on how to get to the end result in an efficient time. So it's approachable. You can have a pre-filing to look into the initial thoughts whether you should proceed in the process. And I think what is very relevant, that's not just for the Dutch, but Gianluca may also consider that from an Italian perspective. I think preparation is a key factor to success of an APA. Don't think of it too lightly. There's a lot of work to be done, but having a full and complete file when filing for an APA actually has major benefits in terms of processing, in terms of speed, and in terms of getting to the end result. So be prepared and don't step in just because you think it's a good idea. You need some preparation to do so. One last thing I want to mention is that in the past, in the Dutch practice, you could not get APAs on financial transactions specifically, but that has been changed recently. So nowadays, it's also possible for financial transactions to be subject to an APA request, which is, I think, a good development, especially when financial transactions have been in the spotlight for the last couple of years. So having the opportunity to get into an APA on financial transactions is certainly, I think, a good development. I will stop here for some Dutch perspective, and I'd rather turn the mic to Gianluca to address the Italian practice.
Thank you, Richard. Indeed, let's go to you, Gianluca. What are the most relevant features of the Italian APAs?
So first of all, hello, Adrian and Richard. It's definitely a pleasure to be here, sharing some knowledge and experience. So let's jump immediately into the topics. And I think that it's first worth considering that the APA regime was introduced more than 20 years ago in Italy. So it's not such brand new. So the central revenue in Italy has gained, I would say, quite a lot of experience in negotiating this kind of agreement with any type of multinational enterprise, which is of course good in terms of outcome of the APA and the level of discussion that we may have with the specialist of the central revenue. The APA, even if today we are focusing on transfer pricing matters, of course, in Italy, the APA can cover also other specific items, like, for example, the attribution of profit to permanent establishments, both in case we are dealing with an Italian branch of a foreign entity and in the opposite case. So when we have a foreign branch of an Italian company. In addition to this, we can say bring to the APA table for a discussion with the tax authorities also other topics that have an international taxation impacts like dividends, royalties, and interest. So the application of double tax treaty and where relevant also of the European Union law provisions. The APA in Italy is structured to have 5 year duration. So we had the chance when signing an APA to properly organize and set our business model accordingly. So in order to keep monitor and manage the consequent taxation impacts. And I think this is one of the brand new aspects that were introduced officially as of 2021. We can ask also the retroactive effect of the agreement that we are about to negotiate with the tax authorities. Lastly, in 2021, also bilateral and multilateral AVAs have been introduced. So there is the chance to have, let me say, a full coverage of all the aspects that may be actually discussed during an ABA. So I will stop here. Otherwise, of course, we would introduce too many topics for the time we have today.
Yeah. Thank you, Gianluca. I think you also maybe covered a part of the next topic. So, what are the benefits and pros of an APA? Maybe Richard, can you give your thoughts on this matter? And please, Gianluca, feel to interrupt Richard whenever you think it's right to do so.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think the most obvious benefit of an APA, obviously, is that you get certainty as a company. You get some certainty about the tax matters, the transfer pricing, and that is helpful because it avoids a lot of frustration, discussion at a later stage. So having an APA actually allows companies to know where they are going to. They don't have to bother about discussions with tax authorities. And especially if you have a multi or a bilateral APA, you cover all the relevant countries involved. So that means you actually have almost like a foolproof certainty. That is different if you only look at a unilateral APA, because that, as the name tells you, only addresses the vision of one country. That means still that another country may have a different opinion, but still it's halfway there. So I think certainty is the most obvious benefit
Yeah.
of an APA. What do you
Yeah.
think, Gianluca?
Thank you, Richard. Maybe I also heard you talk about unilateral versus bilateral and multilateral APAs. What is your experience in Italy, Gianluca? Is there a specific favor for one of those APAs, or?
Oh, well, it's up to the company belonging to a multinational enterprise to choose the type of APA they want to discuss with the central revenue. Of course, as Richard anticipated, we have to be aware since the very beginning of this negotiation, because it's a negotiation in the end, even if friendly, but still a negotiation. We have to be aware since the very beginning of, let me say, the effects that a bilateral or multilateral APA have compared to a unilateral APA. So actually, the bilateral or multilateral APA may take longer time for the negotiation and say the final, let me say, settlement of all the clauses and aspects of such an agreement. But of course, the impact is definitely higher and more relevant. In this discussion concerning APA, I think that at least from an Italian standpoint, just to keep in mind what Richard just shared with us, the point is that we will have to discuss with a dedicated team of the central revenue. So in the APA discussion, notwithstanding it will be a unilateral or, for example, a bilateral one, we won't have to cope with the local tax office in charge of the tax position of the company. Instead, we will interact directly with the APA team based in Rome. They have a kind of second branch office in Milan too, but actually, we will have to interact with the revenue specialists, which, of course, enhances the level of the discussion and also the types of complexities and technicalities that we may face. I'm thinking, for example, about the application of the transactional profit split method, which during tax inspections in the field, let me say, usually raises a lot of uncertainties, doubts, and also challenges by the tax office because of the high level of, say, discretionary aspects that the profit split brings in. So the APA context could be the right one also to introduce a discussion on very complex topics.
Yeah, maybe to address a bit like what you said, Gianluca, having a specialist to talk to obviously helps in getting to a solution, and especially in transfer pricing, sometimes cases can be very complex, and then it certainly helps to have people on the table that actually have relevant experience with the matter, instead of a general practitioner who may still have a very willing approach, but if he lacks the experience, it becomes more difficult. When I look back in my own experience as a tax inspector, I know one thing for sure: if I'm not comfortable, my initial response will be no, instead of maybe. So having an explanation and having some experience on the table certainly helps in the process. Maybe that brings me to another point that I'd like to raise. If you're thinking about pros and benefits of an APA, thinking about transfer pricing cases, complex cases, relevant experience is important. But I also think that a major benefit of an APA discussion is that you have a discussion, or at least the opportunity to have a discussion, in a more cooperative fashion. If you think about discussions with tax authorities, you have two main um, uh, situations, you have a audit discussion, which is retrospective. Facts are carved in stone. You cannot undo the facts, and you can have a quite harsh and difficult discussion. If you have a discussion, let's say looking forward, it's not that carved in stone. You can still have a bit of leeway to manage your operations in a way that everybody might be comfortable with, and that is an APA type of discussion. So having the possibility to be flexible from both sides actually makes it a quite interesting process, which can lead to very reasonable results, whereas the same discussion 2 years down the road after the facts would have been a major disaster.
That's very true. Well, I would pick up two points that you mentioned in your statements. And actually, first, the say friendly atmosphere. Don't want to exaggerate, but of course, as you said, it's very different compared to the situation we usually face when a tax inspection jumps in. So when they knock at the door, the tax
Mhm.
inspectors. Here, of course, it's our proactive attitude that takes us to the APA team, say, we are here, we want to negotiate in advance in order to avoid litigation and very heavy controversies from any standpoint that may come in the future. And this is positive. We have experienced the same kind of cooperative attitude also here in Italy, negotiating with the APA officers of the central revenue. And the second point is, of course, related to the complexities, as we said, and also to the possibilities to properly design the intercompany flows and the way to manage intercompany transactions.
Mhm.
During the preparation of of this podcast, I must admit, we mentioned the fact that the APA negotiation is a real negotiation, so is an interaction. So it would be a wrong expectation from taxpayer side to sit at the table and actually um, want the tax office, the APA team, simply to bless and give a green light on what we are presenting. It's a negotiation, so we must be very well prepared. We have to actually already done our homeworks before knocking at the door of the APA team. So it means proper transfer pricing analysis, mapping of intercompany transactions, general overview, cross-country overview of what we are going to implement and doing from nowadays onwards, but also with a strategic, let me say, look also on what happened in the recent past. Because, of course, the APA office, which is going to bind the entire tax administration for a number of years, will be very careful in granting or signing any kind of, say, agreement.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. I think Gianluca, that's I think also the part of our last discussion. But what should you consider as a multinational before embarking in APA? I think you already mentioned a few items here, Richard. Maybe you can give your thoughts on that.
I think what is relevant to consider is that, especially if you look at the trend nowadays to have more bilateral APAs, the process becomes more complex. But you always then have multiple tax authorities at the table, and they have different interests at stake. So that makes it even more complex. But as a taxpayer, you know, almost like you will have an adversary country, and you will have a country that is more like an ally to your case in that respect. And managing the process means also there that you think about how to get both countries involved. And sometimes you can align with a country to, let's say, have a concerted reasoning to convince the other party, which being the other country. But then again, as a taxpayer, you are not really a party to the negotiations between the countries, but there is a lot of ground to cover before the countries actually close the door and get to their final negotiations. So, considering the fact that you may have an ally at your hand in a certain discussion, certainly may help reaching a good solution.
Okay. Maybe Gianluca, do you have any thoughts on other items you should consider before embarking APA?
Well, I think that a proper self-assessment, let me use this wording, is appropriate as well. We are talking about transfer pricing topics to be discussed in the context of this advanced pricing agreement, but of course we all know that when we analyze the value chain and the role in the intercompany flows of all the entities involved, we may say detect or face additional issues that may relate, for example, to the tax residence of the companies belonging to the group. So, for example, we may face or we may realize that we have undisclosed PE issues, for example, in the countries that we would like to involve in the APA procedure. So, a self assessment in order to be aware if there are other topics that may become issues or even showstoppers, I think it's fundamental in this kind of discussion. That means disclosure, basically self disclosure with tax authorities.
Yeah, maybe I think you had a very true point, Gianluca. I think the main message I would give to anyone is you do not want to be surprised while in the APA process. So you need to do your preparation and be aware of what the potential discussions might be, so you can anticipate them. Because it's never a good thing to be really surprised. Maybe one thing I would like to ask you, Gianluca, because my experience is that there is a difference in countries, because you request an APA, but you do not have the guarantee that you actually will get one, right? So there are always situations where a APA request doesn't lead to an agreement, and either the request is withdrawn or it's been rejected. Um, but then the question for a company will be, and what happens then? Will I face like almost certain an audit scrutiny or not? And I think that differs per country, in my experience. For instance, in the Netherlands, you don't necessarily get a full audit if an APA is not being granted, but it is taken into account in, let's say, the full risk assessment of the authorities to actually make a decision whether or not to audit. But maybe you can give some highlights also on the Italian case or other relevant experiences in that fact.
Well, in case of negative outcome of the discussion for the APA, there won't be an immediate kind of automatic assessment against the company. So, and this is important. But of course, even if we have separate teams, as I shared, APA team on the one hand, say sitting in Rome, and the local tax office doing the ordinary tax inspection work on the other side. Well, the APA team for sure will inform about the negative outcome the local tax office. So, in case we won't be able to reach an agreement, we must either say expect the local tax office knocking at the door in order to dig with a different approach into our specific situation.
Yeah. I think what I also experienced is the other way around. Let's say that you started with a full blown audit. In a complex case, you were not able to get to a solution um, unless it was, let's say, considered to expand the dispute to also look forward to future years and then combine, let's say, the audit discussion with an APA discussion. What if the topic would be similar in the years back and forth. Um, so starting from an audit discussion, the APA process and the opportunity to combine a solution that is not just for past years, but also would grant you at least some future certainty. In my experience, sometimes actually helps you to get to a solution at all.
Yeah,
And that is sometimes considered beneficial both by the tax authorities as well as the companies involved, because nobody wants to get, let's say, stuck with a major transfer pricing dispute if you
yeah.
can avoid it. And sometimes the APA actually allows you to get to other solutions than otherwise.
Maybe a question for you both. I think listeners are also interested in what the costs are. I think some countries have a specific admission fee, basically.
Mhm.
What should a multinational consider as well for other costs? So maybe internal resource. Are there any other items in the Netherlands and Italy that you're aware of?
Well,
Maybe start
Gianluca,
with Gianluca.
So with regard to Italy, unilateral APA does not require any admission fee on the taxpayer in order to be admitted. So it's free of charge. Differently, bilateral or multilateral APAs require the payment of specific admission fees per country involved. These admissions fees are differentiated according to the size of the group. So it will be the consolidated turnover to be relevant. And basically, for those under the threshold of 100 million euros, we will have 10,000 euros to be paid as admission fee. These admission fees will become 30,000 euros for those companies belonging to multinational with size up to 750 million euros. And of course, for those even bigger, we have 50,000 euros of admission fees. So there is, of course, a proper analysis in terms of costs and benefits to be properly done in advance. So before embarking, let me
And
say,
APA.
the
Yeah.
path of an MBA.
Okay. And Richard, in the Netherlands, are there any admissions fees, or were there
now,
any in your time when you were head of the APA team in
now
this next?
there were no fees, and I still think there are no fees for APAs in the Netherlands. Even bilateral ones are without any entry fee. Um, but obviously, the admission fees are only part of the costs for a company involved, right? Because you do need to do your analysis, you do need to be prepared, have your documentation ready, etc. Um, and then you have a lengthy process of communicating, and that's very difficult or different per APA case, so to say. Um, the quicker the process, the lesser the cost involved, obviously. I think it depends a bit on the countries involved. Some countries tend to have a lot of questioning and a lot of up and forth communications, so that takes a lot of time from the internal people of the company, but also from the advisory involved, which makes it more costly
Okay.
at the end of the day. That means also that from a company perspective, the cost benefit analysis will be made and should be made, because it's not a cheap process, especially if you look at bilateral or multilateral processes. So it makes sense that those type of
Yeah,
requests
should be considered upfront. Yeah,
should
yeah. Okay, maybe yeah, I've heard quite some interesting items today. May I try to summarize a little bit, and please feel free to add any items you think are also very relevant for the listeners to take into account. I think the pros and the most large benefit is certainty upfront, both on the operational design and related tax treatment from a transfer pricing perspective. Another benefit is that you have interaction with a transfer pricing specialist, so that also talks easier. Basically, you have the same background, the same information. Um, you have an ally when under scrutiny. If you have an APA, obviously, if you have a bilateral APA, you have both tax authorities already an approval stamp. However, you still have to do a proper self-assessment, and also upfront, also taking into account the costs. So not only admission fees, but also internal resources and external advisory fees. It is a negotiation, not a mere blessing. I think that was also yeah, very important item as discussed by you both. And there may sometimes be a non-coordination between the APA office and the local tax team. So that may also be a risk sometimes. Final item, there are no admission fees in the Netherlands and in Italy for APAs. However, in Italy, you may have some admission fees depending on size and other items on bilateral and multilateral APAs. Did I forget any very important items, Gianluca, Richard?
Well, as a final remark and comment, I would recommend a kind of proactive attitude on the multinational enterprise and real will to sign an APA with the tax administration. It's not something that you say, let's start and see, but let's start and take this to the end. So it has to do with proactive attitude, cooperation, reaction in providing information to the tax administration involved. And this, of course, will have an impact on the overall duration of the entire process, which could be an issue as well, of course.
Okay. Richard, anything to add?
Yeah, I'd like to add something to this. I fully agree with Gianluca, and I think one thing I'd want to highlight also is that, as we said, it is a very lengthy process. You need to prepare well. You need to have a lot of evaluations done. I think one benefit I'd still like to mention for an APA process is that as a company, it allows you to choose your timing. You are in the driver's seat of initiating the discussion, which is totally different than just sitting and waiting for an authority to come by and audit you and have a similar discussion. So having the possibility to be proactive and to be in the driver's seat actually is something that is sometimes, let's say, undervalued by companies, especially when you take that into account that if there is something that needs to be discussed under the current, let's say, transparency international between countries and the exchange of information, that is likely to pop up if it's of major importance. So being able to schedule and time your own resources and discussions with the authorities involved should be given fair thought.
Okay. Yeah, I would like to thank you, Richard and Gianluca, for contributing to this podcast, and I want to thank all our listeners for basically listening to our first episode of our new podcast. Stay tuned for more transfer pricing topics and more guests in the future. Hope to see you all next time. Have a great day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.